All right, make sure you're being careful when you read this question. There's a lot going on. So which finding from these first two people's study, if true, would most directly weaken the claim made by the people who favor the traditional view of voter behavior? So the claim made by the people who favor the traditional view. So I need to know what the traditional view is. I need to know what this study is. Let's start with that. Political scientists who favor the traditional view, thankfully they're very clear about it, of voter behavior claim that voting in an election does not change a voter's attitude toward the candidates in that election. Okay, so voting does not change attitude. Okay, focusing on each U.S. presidential election from 1976 to 1996, these people tested this claim by distinguishing between subjects who had just become old enough to vote, around half of whom actually voted, and otherwise similar subjects who were slightly too young to vote, and thus none of them voted. These people compared the attitudes of the groups of subjects toward the winning candidate 2 years after each election. So if you favor the traditional view, it's not going to change. So then if it's weakening, so voting does change the attitude. I'm just flipping it, right? I'm just flipping it. If it weakens it, then it's going to say it's wrong. So they're going to find that there's a change. So I don't know. Let's see if there's something that matches with that. A, subjects' attitudes toward the winning candidates 2 years after a given election were strongly predicted by subjects' general political orientation, regardless of whether subjects were old enough to vote. Okay, so two things about this. First of all, did they ever talk about political orientation? Did they talk about what party people belong to? No, that was not part of this conversation at all. Second of all, and this is probably even worse, regardless of whether they were old enough to vote, the whole point of the experiment is that they're separating people into two groups, those who were old enough to vote and those who were not. So if you're telling me regardless there's no difference between these people, then you're kind of undermining the experiment. So this has got a big red flag just because of the way that they're kind of putting these separate groups back into the same group again. That's missing the point. B, subjects who were not old enough to vote in a given election held significantly more positive attitudes towards the winning candidate 2 years later than they held at the time of the election. Okay, let me just be careful there. Subjects who were not old enough to vote. So those are the people who didn't vote. So their attitudes changed, but that's not what we said, right? We're expecting it to be the case that the people who did vote had a change in attitude. Right, so this seems like the wrong group. Maybe I'm missing something here. So I'm not going to completely eliminate this because it is at least hitting the idea of the separate groups and the change in attitudes, but it seems to be the wrong group. So I don't know. Let's see. C, subjects who voted in a given election held significantly more polarized attitudes toward the winning candidates 2 years later than did subjects who were not old enough to vote. So here it's saying the voted had more polarized attitudes. That seems to match with what we said. It's the voting that does it. So that seems right. Let's look at D. 2 years after a given election, subjects who voted and subjects who were not old enough to vote were significantly more likely to express negative attitudes than positive attitudes toward the winning candidate in that election. Again, I don't really even care about the conclusion. I care about what they're doing by lumping these two groups together. Subjects who voted and subjects who were not old enough to vote, they're both being brought back together. The point of the experiment is we're trying to find a difference between these two groups. And so if we're going to get anything out of the experiment, it's going to be because there's a difference that these two groups showed, right? So this is just less about the voting, less about the passage, and just more about how science is supposed to work. You have an experimental group and a control group, and we expect there to be a difference. So if the question is telling us that the study is going to weaken this claim, then the study has to have an impact. The two groups have to have shown some sort of difference. So both A and D are just missing the point of like how science works. So it's definitely C. I get why this is a confusing question. It's a lot of words to say something very simple, which is why I'm so glad that from the start I had a very simple summary of what I was going to expect to happen just based on the logic and based on understanding the question, right? Knowing what they were going to have me do, I needed to know what the traditional view was, and then I needed to weaken it, meaning I needed to reverse it. I needed to contradict it. So those two things alone were enough for me to kind of understand what I was looking for, so that when I got to these very text-heavy choices, I was able to understand them without needing to parse every single word. It was much more about certain boxes being checked off, and that's always the best way to think about these dense passages.